All right, so again, I'm Lucas, Lucas Evans. I am the Central Area Behavior Analyst, and I will be presenting this presentation along with Melantha and Rita, and I will let Melantha introduce herself and then Rita.
Greetings, I am Melantha Witherspoon. I am the Eastern Area Behavior Analyst.
And good morning, everyone. It's Rita Cooper here, Western Region Area Behavior Analyst.
Excellent, thank you all. And so this training is to, in part, get you ready to serve on one of the Behavior Support Review Committee sessions that we have. And while there are other trainings that you need to complete, this one is should get you ready to use our standard checklist that we're going to talk about today and talk a little bit about how we approach professional peer review in the state of Missouri. So just to give you kind of an overview of what that looks like, today we're going to talk about what is peer review, why it's needed. That's going to lead into sharing what our model is in Missouri, which is the Behavior Support Review Committee, which if you're in this training, you've kind of agreed to serve on, so we're really appreciative of that. And we talk a little about what it means to be a member. We talk a little bit about what the process is, both for you as a committee member and also for teams that would be coming to committee to get reviews. We talk about our tool that we use to assess written behavior support plans and also other supports that may be in place. We talk specifically about our behavior support plan checklist, where it comes from, why it's important. And then we move into looking at the individual elements and helping get you ready to identify those in written plans. And ultimately, we will end off where you will score an actual plan and get feedback and support to be able to do that. So this really, we hope, will put you in a good spot to start serving the actual review piece. And then, of course, once you complete the additional training, you will be a bona fide member of the Behavior Support Review Committee. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about what professional peer review is, and it's sometimes helpful to just start with what does the dictionary say. So this is one dictionary, the Cambridge Dictionary, and what it says is that professional peer review is just the process of having someone read, check, or give feedback on something you've done, whether it's something you've written, some work you've done, and that person should have the same kind of level of experience that you do. So it's one of your professional peers looking over some work that you've done and giving feedback. And I think this actually is a pretty good example and kind of encapsulates what professional peer review is. And so I think this is a good starting spot, and we can go from here. And then we can think a little bit more about like why is professional peer review something that would be important to our field as behavior analysts. And the first place that would be a good place to go is it's one of our ethical obligations and requirements. This used to actually be a complete code within and of itself, 6.01 within the compliance code, which when the new the newest version of the compliance code goes into effect, it actually loses its status as a full code and just gets lumped into part of the introduction. But it is an ethical obligation. It is discussed in our compliance code. It is one of the things that people tend to struggle with a lot. And interestingly enough, kind of the most frequently cited ethical violation in our field is improper or inadequate supervision, which is a little ironic that the board decided to no longer have it be its own section. And even more kind of interesting to note that the reason they did that is because they couldn't enforce the code. So if you think about it, it's been identified as an ethical component of practice. It's been identified that we don't do it really well, and we've decided to, in response to that, just not look for it as a specific code. So that's a problem, but it's still part of ethical practice. It's also part of legal and regulatory requirements. So Rothals, Mosley, and Carlson did a survey back in 2013 of the states in the U.S. And the territories, and of those that responded, which was about a little over 40 states and one in the District of Columbia, actually 44 states in the District of Columbia have responded. So most of the territories and the states responded, and of those, almost all of the states and territories had some policy or regulations around the implementation and development of behavioral supports. And in Missouri, we actually have a CSR, a rule that explicitly lays out how behavior services have to be delivered. And so, you know, we have an obligation to oversee how those things are happening and make sure that they're happening as required. And one of the funding requirements from CMS and HCBS is that the member states, the states that administer the waivers, also have a method for kind of evaluating and looking at the quality of services and how things are going. So there's ethical reasons for the field as a whole to be concerned about professional peer review. There's legal and regulations around having professional peer review, and then there's money tied to having professional peer review. So it is absolutely important. It's kind of a core feature of any professional practice, and it's specifically a feature of behavior analysis in the state of Missouri. So why do professional peer review? Well, I just told you that it's kind of required. And I also just told you that supervision is one of the areas that behavior analysts have struggled the most when it comes to ethical problems. It's also been a problem across the country when it comes to things like Medicaid fraud, which has actually resulted in folks losing service, to freezes on admitting new providers into the waiver pool or the Medicaid provider, so they're no longer, at least for a period, Florida stopped letting new people join to be providers to provide service. So it actually is a really, really big problem. And professional peer review certainly doesn't prevent any of these sorts of problems from happening, but it does hedge against those things, and it creates an atmosphere that is more transparent and more likely to approximate professional practice. And just one thing really quickly. So while these fraud charges are most likely instances of bad actors or kind of evidence of not good behavior, there's lots of things that people do inadvertently, not intentionally, not with malicious intent, to use kind of a non-behavioral analytic framework, that can be problematic that professional peer review can help. So professional peer review is just really a good practice to make sure that all of our professional behavior is kind of meeting the model. So the best thing to do to improve and maintain behavior is get feedback. So that's what this is all about. Narrowing down further to Missouri, here is some data on the Professional Peer Review Committee that you've agreed to join. So we've been running this in one shape or another since 2016. And here's a look at some data from the year 2018 that we actually co-presented with Paul Malanga from Tennessee. So Tennessee also has a similar way to assess behavior support plans. We did a couple co-presentations with him at APBA and ABAI. And here's some data from the committee for the year 2018 that looks at kind of some of the reasons why we need to be concerned about professional peer review. So we're going to talk about this standard checklist in a moment. But even before that, you should be able to recognize the categories on the side here on the horizontal axis. It starts with baseline FBA and goes down through evaluation of fidelity. You should be able to recognize those things as being important to professional practice and to the field of behavior analysis. And if you look at the percent of plans that actually have that element present, which is your x-axis, 100 obviously being what we would want all of the BSPs to be based on the functional assessment. But what we find is actually quite the opposite, is that many of the plans don't have these basic components of good practice, basic components of successful strategies. So not clearly based on a functional assessment, interventions not really aligned to a function, very little visual analysis of data, no teaching or specific instructions for training of staff, programming for generalization is basically non-existent. And nobody's really looking at whether or not strategies are being delivered as intended, that treatment fidelity. So these are pretty concerning data for our state. I will say that, in the evolution of doing this intervention, this professional peer review intervention through the Behavior Support Review Committee, we have improved in each of these elements a little bit over time, but we still have a really long way to go. We don't have 2019, and 2020's data look really bad because COVID, but 2019 data is better than this, but not much. So we have some problems. So you might be asking yourself, well, Lucas, maybe this is just a Missouri issue. Even though I just showed you that there's some, Medicaid fraud issues in other states, and I just told you that the BACB most frequently cited ethical violation was for inadequate supervision, maybe it's the case that particularly having bad plans for individuals in the DD system is just a Missouri problem. Except when you look at other places like, Australia and Queensland, which did a very similar evaluation of written plans that Missouri has taken, use a similar tool, they find the same sorts of things. So in their system, in the DD system in Australia, which is broken up into states like the United States, but in the state of Queensland, anyone who has a restrictive intervention or restrictive procedure in place has to have a behavior support plan. Behavior support plans have to be reviewed by this government office similar to the Division of DD, and they use a checklist, they use a tool to evaluate the quality of those plans. And they find very similar sorts of things. So they don't find plans that clearly identify what the function. They don't find plans that have teaching strategies that identify what they would teach. They don't have plans that communicate objectives, and they don't have plans that have a way to communicate how things are going. And one of the things that is different in Queensland is that not everybody has to be a behavior analyst. And so you might say, well, Lucas, obviously it's the non-behavior analysts that write plans that are poor. And while that is technically true, on their checklist, the max score you can get is a 24 points. There's basically 2 points for each of their 12 elements. And the average plan written by a non-behavior analyst scores a 10 out of 24, so that's really bad. But the average plan written by a behavior analyst scores a 12 out of 24, which is also really bad. So this is not just a Missouri problem. This is kind of a practice problem, and one of the reasons why we have to do professional peer review. And in Missouri, so we've gone from Missouri to Australia. Now we're back to Missouri and looking at how things have gone for our professional peer review process in our state. And what we found, now again, these data aren't perfect, but what we found is that generally it is effective. So if you see this may not be a type of display you're used to seeing. It's a series of bar graphs. You have panels for each year. So the top panel is 2017, middle 2018, bottom 20. Again, 2020. Here, and the average number of risk outcomes that a person had kind of going across time. And you'll notice that the x-axis starts at -12 and goes to -60. And so at that 0 mark, where that line is that runs up the middle of each panel, represents when they came to the committee and got a review. And then if you move left from that line, we get to -6, that's 6 months before the review. And then -12 is 12 months before the review. And then it's the same on the opposite way. So when you get to the +6, that's 6 months after the review. 12 is 12 months after the review. And these are relative to when they were reviewed. So if you took everybody who got reviewed in 2017 and you set every month that they got reviewed at 0 for each person, and you went back, this is grouping them kind of how they fall in the process. And what we find is as people get closer to when they get reviewed, you have number of risk outcomes on average going up. And when you see directly after kind of that 6 months follow-up, you see a pretty significant reduction in risk outcomes that does generally maintain in 12 months. If you extend this out a little farther, what you will find though is that it does tend to go back up, which is one of the things that we're working on to kind of maintain that good effect with additional follow-up. But generally it's effective. It's proved effective over multiple years. It's generally the same pattern. People get worse until they get reviewed, and then they get better for a time. And just if you're wondering what those eyes are on each bar, that is an error bar. So that kind of gives you a sense of how far above and below that mean line individual data points are distributed, to kind of let you know that there's not a whole bunch of spread, so it's fairly tightly packed. These data indicate to me, or highly suggest to me, that our intervention is effective at least reducing risk in the short term. And so given that we need to do it for ethical, legal, money, professional reasons, and plans don't typically have it, and it's effective at making risk down. So this is one of those things that we need to continue to do. And so we find it a very beneficial and important intervention in our state. All right, I'm going to pass it on to Melantha now. And Melantha, when you need me to switch, I'll try to anticipate it, but if I go too slow, just say slide.
Awesome, thank you. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about how peer review works in Missouri, what the Behavior Support Review Committee does. Slide. So the whole purpose of the Behavior Support Review Committee is to encourage the implementation of best practice strategies that lead to greater independence while enhancing the quality of life for individuals with the most complex behavioral needs. Next slide, Lucas, please. Thank you, that was very smart. All right, thank you, thank you, thank you. And I'm ready if we're not recording it.
We're recording.
Okay, thank you. So some of the goals that we hope to accomplish is we want to ensure that we meet Medicaid waiver assurances. The Department of Mental Health has agreed that we would make sure there's a process in place to make sure that individuals that have the most complex behavioral needs are being, to ensure that scientific strategies are being implemented and the least restrictive interventions are in place. And so having those behavior support plans reviewed, as well as ISPs, is a method to ensure that those things are happening. We also want to make sure that clinicians are following ethical guidelines, and that the strategies that are outlined in both the ISP and the behavior support plan leads to progress of greater independence and a person having a meaningful, enhanced, good quality of life. So this is done by, again, having teams come to committee and reviewing their documents to determine if the ISP and the behavior support plan is going to, it has all the necessary elements to ensure that their quality of life will improve, that all of the necessary elements are included in the behavior support plan, and that's done by using the checklist, which will be the focus of this training. And again, that the teams get consultation for the whole person and the person support system. So those objectives are met when people come through committee. So the committee consists of a chair and committee members. The chair is a licensed behavior analyst that is appointed by the division. Committee members are volunteers that are licensed to practice and or teach applied behavior analysis. And sometimes there are members who are working towards certification and that's receiving supervision under a licensed behavior analyst. The role of the members will be to review redacted information. So sometimes there is a behavior support plan that committee members review. So they look through the behavior support plan. It doesn't have any personal information. They look at data. Sometimes that's monthly, included in a monthly progress note. And so they're reviewing the information. They complete the checklist if there's a behavior support plan, and they get that turned in to the chair of the meeting. During the meeting, their role is to introduce themselves, to ask clarifying questions. And after clarifying questions and the team has shared updates, committee members are responsible for sharing recommendations that lead to a greater independence and a better quality of life for the person. Another responsibility or role of committee members is we know that you guys are volunteering your time. We greatly appreciate it. We know that your schedules are packed. So in the event that you can't show up for a meeting, we just ask that you give the chairperson a heads up about that, and or if you gain additional responsibilities and you can no longer be a committee member, please inform the chair about that information as well. Again, we are doing our best to review the folks who have the greatest needs. And so individuals with the highest level of risk are requested to attend the meeting. Their team is invited, and some of the criteria that helps us to identify those with the greatest needs are folks who have 3 or more behavioral EMTs in the last 90 days, people who have enhanced staffing hours, and that's about 720 hours of staffing, people who are on 10 or more psychotropic medications, people who are accessing the emergency room and the hospital for behavioral health needs, and those who are experiencing prohibited procedures and so and practices. And so there is a webinar that talks about prohibited practices, and so I'll just throw a few out there for you. The use of door locks to keep a person from eloping, prone restraints, turning someone's wheelchair off. All of those things are prohibited. Having peers restrain another individual when they're displaying unsafe behaviors. And so those would be some of the criteria that one or more or any of those criteria that I just discussed are what would identify a person as needing some additional consultation from the Behavior Support Review Committee. Teams also have the option to self-refer. And so That's an option as well. All right, now I am going to allow there to be an introduction about the checklist. Rita, I think you're going to do.
Thank you.
Oh,
Go ahead, Martha.
no worries. Go right ahead. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take over for a few slides now. I'm going to talk a little bit about the standard tool that we use, specifically on kind of where it comes from, and then Rita's going to lead into what the actual items are. So this first little graphic that we like to start off showing, and hopefully all of these words here are something that you can pretty quickly identify as a paper you probably read back in graduate school, and hopefully something that you still actually think about from time to time. But these are the 7 dimensions that Baer, Wolf, and Risley penned all the way back in the 60s. Actually had the last paper in the first issue of JABA that kind of outlined what our field is, and these are those 7 dimensions of like what applied behavior analysis is. You have applied, analytical, behavioral, conceptually, systematic, generalization, effective, and technological. And so thinking about those dimensions, which are still a really good kind of rule of thumb for what an applied practice should be. So if you think about a science of applied behavior analysis and then the practice of behavior analysis, like these dimensions still make sense, whether you're looking from a scientific research standpoint, from a professional practice. And so how does the behavior support plan fit into all of this stuff? Well, a behavior support plan, by definition, is a piece of technology. If you remember what that dimension is, it's basically a series of instructions or some material that can ensure that you get consistent implementation or consistent delivery of strategies or consistent behavior over time. And so it is that document through which the other dimensions are kind of brought to bear on this person's problem situation. So it's the way that you bring a science that focuses on socially significant behavior in a way that uses analysis, focuses on behavior consistent with what we know must be in place for people to learn, that leads to behavior change that maintains and expands to meet requirements of new settings, and that's effective not just right now, not just in the clinic, not just in the home, but in a person's life, and helps them kind of have an effective life in a way that doesn't need our service anymore. So that's what a behavior support plan is supposed to do, which is a kind of a lot of weight that it has to carry. And that's why it's so important that we have some sort of standard metric by which we evaluate them. And, you know, we could have just like made something up, but we, being good stewards of our science and good behavior analysts, we decided we probably shouldn't do that. So we went to the literature and we said, what does the literature say? What does research say should be in a behavior support plan? And lo and behold, our own Dr. Teresa Rogers, who just recently retired from the division, was the chief behavior analyst for many years, actually was one of the first folks to write about this all the way back in 1992. So her and some other people you may not have heard of, Timothy Vollmer, Brian Awada, and Jennifer Zarconi, came together and actually looked at what are those essential elements that need to be in place for behavior treatment plans, which is the same thing as behavior support plan, our positive behavior support plan, like all those different names. But they looked at it back in '92 in South Florida and the adult institution setting. They actually compared 2 institutions, one that was affiliated with the Behavior Analytics School, University of South Florida, and one that wasn't, and tried to determine what are the necessary components that each one of those had, came up with a set that made sense, found that those components were something that, I apologize for the sound of the grass, that experts in the field that they surveyed actually agreed with it, and also was in alignment with the legal requirements at the time and the basic research. And this kind of leads into a follow-up paper that Williams, who was a student of Bulmer, took back up in 2015. They took the original 92 paper, looked at those original elements, evaluated whether they still made sense, added some new ones, kind of repeated the initial minus the assessment of plans and practice, but surveyed experts and found that, yeah, these things still made sense. So those things, they updated it for the most recent legal requirements, because those things have kind of changed over the last 30 years. And so delivered basically the same sort of elements with some minor tweaks. So again, this is in the adult DD system, specifically in institutions. So let's look outside of that. So you also have a group of folks in Southern California, Browning, Wright, Mayer, and Sarin, in the school systems that developed a set of essential elements of behavior support plans to use in schools called the Behavior Support Plan Quality Evaluation Tool. Now it's in its second edition. And what they did was looked at a large collection, hundreds of behavior support plans that were used in schools that were effective, distilled them down to the basic components that seemed to be in place across all of them. They validated this with about 100 graduate students in behavior analytic programs to make sure that, one, it made sense, two, that they could consistently score it. They created this tool, and lo and behold, it was associated with plans that were of higher quality and were more likely to be effective. And those elements were remarkably similar to the elements that Bulmer, Iwata, Zarkani, and Rogers came up with independently and seemingly unaware of one another. They were about the same. And then there's also been some folks in the mix here between these two groups. So Ron Horner and George Sagai also came up with some essential elements that were remarkably similar. You have Jonathan Tarbuck did some work on essential elements for autism treatment, specifically for providing distance or virtual, and those things are remarkably consistent. And finally, in 2018, you have a group of folks led by Quigley that kind of took all of this together and looked at it and said, okay, do these things agree over time? So you're talking about a period of time from 1992 to 2018. And what they found is, yeah, absolutely. Like, there's been remarkable consistency in what professionals and experts say is best practice for such a long period of time with such consistency that there is really no reason not to adopt it as a best practice standard. Now, is there room for empirical evaluation of these elements? Absolutely. However, there's no reason not to adopt them as best practice standards because they agree with basic science, they agree with expert consensus, they agree with legal requirements. So we should adopt these as best practice standards. And if you happen to be in a graduate program and you want to experimentally evaluate which ones are the more necessary ones, I think you should do that. And until then, we should use them as a best practice standard. All right, I'm going to pass it back to Rita, and I'm going to turn my mic off so you guys don't have to listen to it a lot.
Well, thank you, Lucas and Melantha, for such a great introduction into the actual elements of the checklist and their alignment. And that's what I want to spend some time with now, is to really take a look at the checklist that we use here in Missouri, give you a little background about what you see in front of you, and then talk about each of the elements of the checklist. So what we did, of course, as Lucas mentioned, we spent a lot of time developing the checklist prior to the 2016 timeframe when we started the Behavior Support Review Committee. Dr. Rogers, the previous area behavior analyst, spent a lot of time culminating everything, and the checklist elements that we'll talk about today and then that will apply have evolved over time also. So, we've taken what we originally had and we've tweaked it and made it even better. So what you have here is the element, the component, then where in the task list you may find a crosswalk of, why does this apply? Also, we tie it back to the compliance code. And then we took a survey, as we said, of other states that have used similar task lists. And those were the states that we looked at on a closer basis. As you can see, we looked at 6 states. We looked at what we're doing, what Tennessee is doing, Florida, Georgia, California, and Utah. And you can then note which states have those similar elements. So with that kind of background set up, let me go through each of the elements of the checklist. Element 1 is the interventions are aligned to identified function. And we look at the components having clear antecedents, clear behavior, clear consequent conditions, and that the intervention logically is related to the context. Now, I'm not going to go through each of the task list elements, but I want to let you know that those areas under C are considered behavior change considerations. Under E, those are specific behavior change procedures. I is the assessment area, and J is the intervention. And, on a general level, just to kind of remind you elements of maybe a couple of those compliance code areas, we're looking at treatment and intervention efficacy. We're looking at the assessment process. We're looking at describing the conditions under which behavior change is successful. And so I think, that embodies that whole process of what we're looking for in element 1, that the interventions aligned with the identified function. And again, we're trying to crosswalk you through so you realize that this checklist is founded in not only the research, but also in our everyday requirements of the task list and compliance code, and that other states also have similar processes in place. All right. Element 2, this is behavior targeted for increase or decrease, are defined in observable and measurable terms. Those components that we're looking at have at least one behavior targeted for increase, one behavior targeted for decrease. That, of course, as the element embodies there, behaviors are in observable and measurable terms. And we also want to ensure that if there are psychotropic medications prescribed, that the symptoms of the behaviors are associated with the medication. And we'll get into that a little more as we examine the checklist further with the examples and non-examples. So, and of course, you might, problem identification is the task list element for G, and measurement, of course, is I. What we have is treatment, intervention, efficacy, and of course, because we're tying in that medical component of the psychotropic medications, we have medical consultation. So part of what we need to do is address our interface with the psychiatric community in this area to kind of make sure that those align. And of course, Utah didn't have any information regarding this being part of their checklist. Under element 3, we're looking at measurable and time-limited goals for the targeted behaviors that improve quality of life. And we added, that element of quality of life is very critical, because a plan shouldn't just change behavior for behavior's sake, but for, of course, having that face validity, that social validity associated with changing somebody's quality of life. Therefore, the components that we're looking at, our goals are measurable, time limited, related to specific behaviors for increase. And as I mentioned, that the goals are increasing the quality of life, and that the behavior specified for increase is socially relevant for that person. And hopefully when we develop those behavior support plans, that the individual who the plan is for actually gets to be part of that process. What we've tried to also encompass is the concept of smarter goals in the whole process of outlining, that they're specific, meaningful, achievable, relevant, time-bound, and that we evaluate and re-review. But when we're looking at the task list, what we're looking at is assessment, intervention, and when we're looking at the compliance code, we're looking at those areas of responsibility of behavior analyst, what we're required to do, the rights of the client, again, that, you know, it's socially relevant for that individual. So ensuring that we have those areas addressed so that the individual has the opportunity to be part of the process. And as you can see, all states that we reviewed have this as part of the element. And it gets back to some of the data that Lucas shared with us, that, you know, we are able to at least have plans that have observable and measurable behavior in it, as the study from Australia indicated. Element number 4, we're looking at instructions for data collection and the procedures that reflect the behavior. Specifically, the components under that element are specific instructions for how data is to be collected on all targeted behaviors, and that data collection reflects the relevant dimensions of behavior. You know, making sure that we're measuring frequency, if that's what we want to measure, or we're measuring other elements, frequency, rate, whatever might be relevant for the particular behavior of concern. When we're looking at those task list elements that would align with that, we would be looking at, of course, the 2 major elements of measurement in A and H. When we're looking at those compliance code elements, we're looking at our responsibility to the client for treatment and intervention efficacy, and also under 4, we're looking at the responsibility for behavior change programs, and that we tailor them to the individual and to the particular behavior of concern. And again, the states, all of the 6 states, Missouri, Tennessee, Florida, Georgia, California, and Utah, agreed that these were components that were included in their checklist. Element 5, we're looking at the antecedents to affect the probability of the targeted behavior for increase or decrease. We're looking at antecedent strategies that increase the likelihood of the behavior targeted for increase, and antecedent strategies to decrease the likelihood of the challenging behavior. Under the task list, we're looking at elements of behavior change, specific behavior change procedures. And then when we're looking at the compliance code, again, that ties back to behavior change and, of course, the least restrictive procedures. And all of the states agreed that those were critical elements to be included in their checklist. I haven't seen any questions in the chat, so we're keeping track of that as we move along. Element number 6 are instructions for reinforcement of the behavior targeted for increase with identifying potentially reinforcing stimuli. Those components include specific instructions for how to reinforce the behavior, the schedules of reinforcement being identified, and the potential reinforcement identified as part of a reinforcement strategy. So there's a comprehensive approach in the process. Of course, the task list is focusing on really those elements of behavior change, the unwanted effects of reinforcement, the use of negative and positive reinforcement, the appropriate parameters of those schedules of reinforcement. We're also looking at behavior change systems. Under F, we're looking at implementation, management, and supervision. Again, those strategies have to be executed. And then, of course, the assessment process that we design preference assessments to identify reinforcers. We've got to include the individual, and we've got to make sure that we're constantly assessing those preferences and actually what is reinforcing. When we look at the compliance code, we're looking at behavior change program information specifically under section 4. And, one of these that jump out to me, is the fact that, ensuring that least restrictive elements and procedures are always included. And, we as a profession have the responsibility to choose positive reinforcers before we resort to anything of a negative nature or punishment. And I think that's something that we always need to remember in the process. As you can see, Utah didn't mention this, and I want to, as an aside to that, Utah has a newly developed process, so they don't necessarily have as many of the elements or components as the other states have had. I haven't looked at it recently, but when we had done this previously, they were just starting to get their checklist in place. I'd be curious, I haven't looked to see where they're at now. So let's take a look at 7, reactive strategies for behavior targeted for decrease. And again, we're looking at specific instructions as the component parts of how to respond to the challenging behaviors and strategies likely to decrease or minimize the reinforcement of that behavior targeted for decrease. When we're looking at the task list, we're looking at, go figure, behavior change considerations, and also that we're using what we're doing in collaboration with others. When we're looking at the compliance code, again, it ties directly back to behavior change programs, to the consideration of punishment procedures, and of course, that least restrictive element. And again, Utah is missing as its consideration for this particular element. Element 8 is the evaluation of the efficacy of behavioral strategies. Of course, we're looking for the visual display of data, that contextual variables are present in the display, that there's clear demarcation of the baseline and the intervention phases, including when the strategies for change occur, and also visual progress is logically related to the strategy changes. So we need a graph. We need all the elements that we would expect to find in a graph that's used by a behavior analyst. Of course, A and H are your measurement task list elements, and A and H are clearly delineating what we need to do, that we need to design, plot, and interpret the data, that we need to measure effectively, measure the rate, the frequency, the duration, that we need to ensure that the observations and the recording periods are appropriate. And when we get to the examples, you'll see something that you may get a chuckle out of, and that's why I bring up that observation and recording period. When we're looking at the compliance code, we're looking at, it's our obligation to document our professional work, to record and analyze data. And section 2 is that recording. Section 3 of the compliance code is that behavior analytic assessment. And Utah doesn't have this as one of its elements that it's looking for. Item number 9 measures the fidelity of the implementation and the strategies and ensuring to maintain high fidelity. We're looking specifically as the components of instructions, how fidelity will be measured. We're looking at the instructions on what will be done to maintain high fidelity or to remediate low fidelity. We're looking then at the specific plan for communicating that information and the progress to the relevant stakeholders. When we look at the task list, it is no wonder that K is implementation, management, and supervision. Again, that, as Lucas had mentioned, one of the areas that there is most fault found in the process and is supervision. So fidelity is based on that oversight. And then the compliance code areas we're looking at is treatment and intervention efficacy, supervisory delegation and supervision is those elements, and communication. So section 5 of that compliance code is heavy on the supervision and heavy on the communication areas. Here 5.06 is behavior analysts design feedback and reinforcement systems in a way that improve supervisees. So not only are we looking at how we do things for the individual, we're also looking at how we do things for those who are actually implementing the plans. And the last element of the checklist is describe specific strategies to promote generalization. And as you might recall from the information that Lucas shared, is generalization is rarely included as part of the elements of a behavior support plan. I believe in ours, there were only maybe 2% if we're lucky, and then 0 or 1% for the Australian study. Our task list elements under J are intervention, and under K is implementation, management, and supervision. And when we look at the compliance code, we're looking for treatment and intervention efficacy, interpreting or discontinuing services. And I think that's an important element that we often forget sometimes. Section 2.15, when do we stop services? As Lucas had mentioned, generalization should occur in life, not just in specific conditions. But we want to make sure that we are doing and addressing the services as necessary. And Utah is the state that doesn't have the information included on their checklist. So our next section that we'll be addressing is building discrimination capabilities for each of the elements. And this is the checklist in action. And what this, to give you a brief overview and expectation of the next section, since we're shifting, is that we're going to have some examples and non-examples to build discrimination for each of the elements. And then you'll get the opportunity to actually respond to an example that you're given and determine which components may or may not be in the element that you're reviewing. So hopefully you'll get the flow of things as we move forward. Again, we'll give some examples, non-examples, review those. Then you'll get an opportunity to do a check of your knowledge and capability with a challenge question. So I want to give you a few moments to read the context under which we're going to continue the examples throughout. So we'll pause here to read. So hopefully you've had a chance. If you haven't, please indicate in the chat that you need a little more time. Okay, I don't see anyone has entered anything into the chat, so we're going to go ahead on. So our first element is that the interventions are aligned to the identified function. And we're looking for the components of a clear antecedent condition, a clear behavior, clear consequence conditions, and that the intervention logically is related to the context. I want to give you a few moments then to read the example information, and then we'll move on to some analysis so that you can pull out the particular components within that example. Okay, I think we've spent enough time. If you need more time to read that, you'll have it on the next slide as we review the components. So, because it is an example, you'll see that the green pluses indicate that all elements are there, but I want to review that. So, if we're looking at the example, the clear antecedents would be during times of the day when Steve is playing quietly, mom and dad ignore or avoid Steve. So that's an antecedent condition. So what might be the behavior? Well, the behavior is the next line. Steve will scream, yell, well, actually I reversed that. Yell and scream, scream and yell, and destroy property. What are the consequences? Until his parents physically intervene. And they've, you know, so that's our ABC. And then the logical related context in intervention is that the treatment was designed to provide that frequent positive attention during good times. So specifically following typical appropriate requests. So, hey mom, can you come look at this? And additionally, the safe use of leisure items. And that's the intervention. And it seems related to those ABCs. So that's what we're looking for, is that there's clear ABCs and that the intervention is related to the context. Because context is the linchpin to behavior. So this is a non-example. We're going to give you a minute or two to kind of look through this, read it. It's a little shorter because it's a non-example. And again, we're looking for those ABCs and the intervention being related to the context. I'm going to go ahead and move on. So we don't have, as you can see, we put a red X over items that aren't in the non-example, and the green are there indicating which elements, which components are there of the element. There's clear behavior, consequences, intervention not logically related to the context. So a mom and dad avoid Steve. Well, do we know when mom and dad avoid Steve? Well, we don't. So we don't have a good context of when that happens. So that's why it's not very clear. We have a clear behavior, as in the example that we used in previously. Steve will yell, scream, and destroy property until parents physically intervene. The clear consequences there also. The consequences, the treatment program provides an edible after 30 minutes that the problem behaviors don't occur. But the issue was previously, of course, that, he doesn't really ask for a break. He doesn't ask for attention. So that edible is not really logically related to the context that we can really determine given the information. So, as I had mentioned, we actually have a challenge question. And so the element is the interventions are aligned with the function, and we're looking for the components. And your challenge question will present to you each of the components, or there'll be an additional question. None of the components are evident. So give you a moment to read that, and you'll have the opportunity to respond to the poll question. And if you'll go ahead and participants go ahead and respond. We're looking to see which elements are, which components are actually there in the example given. And I'll refrain from talking so you can process. All right, the poll has ended. I should have mentioned previously in setting expectations that you'll have a minute to respond to the challenge questions. So let's kind of review everything here. And thank you for those who responded. So we'll kind of go over what was there, and if anyone has any questions, that's great. It looks like there were questions maybe on the clear behavior, and that's okay. We'll go through this. On days when Steve hasn't slept, that's an antecedent condition. Steve is more likely to engage in property destruction. That's definitely part of what we're identifying, property destruction. This is most likely during times when mom and dad are busy engaged in work tasks, that the property destruction occurs. Mom and dad immediately attend to remove items and spend time lecturing. So that's the consequence of the behavior. And the behavior is defined as the property destruction. And I could see why you might question that, and what is the level of property destruction? And then intervention logically aligns. Treatment was designed to increase the probability that Steve gets a good night's sleep, that his parents check in with him frequently while they're working, and also to teach Steve to recruit attention as well as tolerate the delay for the attention. So based on the information in the first paragraph, the treatment seems to logically align with the related context. Oh, I don't see any questions in the chat. So we'll go ahead and move on to element 2. So element 2 looks at behavior targeted for decrease and increase are defined in observable and measurable terms. And those are the critical elements of observable and measurable terms. And the components are at least one behavior targeted for increase, one behavior targeted for decrease, behavior in observable and measurable terms, and then also that if psychotropic medications are prescribed, the symptom behaviors that the meds are intended to affect are defined. So, and I'll give you a moment to read what we have there. All right, so hopefully you've had, if the examples on the next slide also, so we'll move on. So let's take a look at that. At least one behavior is targeted for increase, and that's the appropriate request for attention. And it's defined there, hey, look at me, come here, waving their hand. I'm sure you can think of all sorts of other ways to appropriately request attention, going over, tapping someone on the shoulder, saying, excuse me. There might be others. One behavior is targeted for decrease. That's the property destruction. And there's a clear definition of the behavior there, throwing, hitting, or slamming items with enough force to damage the items or other property, and the resulting damage is in excess of $50. The other behavior targeted for increase is the safe use of leisure items. And that's also defined then as using leisure items as intended and in a way that does not result in damage. So we're tying all those elements of the behaviors for decrease and increase in together to explain and identify them in observable and measurable terms. And then the last element of the example identifies that Zyprexa is prescribed to treat symptoms such as property destruction. So we have the psychotropic Zyprexa actually paired with the property destruction. So we'll go on to our non-example. And I hit it too fast. Sorry about that. You know the answers already. We'll regroup here. So the non-example, we're looking at the information there. Again, behavior targeted for increase and decrease in observable, measurable terms, looking for those two behaviors, and an identification of a psychotropic and related to the behaviors presented. And like I said, I double clicked and you got to know the answers already. At least one behavior targeted for increase. And in observable and measurable terms. So we have property destruction as clearly defined. The potentially the behavior targeted for increase is not sure what that looks like, appropriate behavior, and the definition of that is saying non-appropriate or inappropriate things. Those definitions are open to interpretation, and there is no mention why the Zyprexa or the behavior that is associated with Zyprexa, it uses that Zyprexa has been prescribed to treat schizoaffective disorder, which is not a behavior that is exhibited, and that Ativan is prescribed to treat anxiety, and anxiety is not a behavior. It's a constellation of a bunch of behaviors, I'm sure, and they vary for people. So the only element that is there is at least one behavior is targeted for decrease, and it is clearly defined in observable and measurable terms. So as is the pattern, we had an example, a non-example, and now you're hopefully up for the challenge, because the challenge question is up next. So again, the element is behavior targeted for decrease. The components, one behavior for increase, one behavior for decrease, and the behaviors in observable, measurable terms, and the psychotropic medication is related to a behavioral symptom. So we've got that challenge question up there. All right, we're coming up on the end of that minute. All right, so let's see what the answers are. Should be pretty evident. So we didn't have anything there. we had a problem behavior. It was deviant and non-compliant behavior that puts property and safety at risk. Wow, that's pretty vague. We had the other, which was maybe for increase, coping skills, build self-management, evidenced by not having problem behaviors. Oh my. And then we know Haldol is prescribed. So none of those components were present at all. So you guys did awesome. Thank you. We're moving on now to element 3 and looking at the components. So element 3 is measurable and time-limited goals for the targeted behaviors that will improve the person's quality of life. So we want to make sure that they're measurable, time-limited, related to specific behavior for increase, and that those goals would increase the quality of life. And then give you a moment to read the example. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move on. I don't see anybody raising their hand or asking for more time. So let's review this. We said it was an example. Are the goals measurable? Well, I'm going to start a little off because the first thing that jumps out at the top of that is by the end of 3 months. So ding, 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 goals are time limited. Steve will increase safe use of leisure items to 60 minutes per day. Increase appropriate requests for attention to 3 times per hour when home. And then for each of those, we have a baseline up from 30 minutes per day at baseline and up from 0.33 times per hour at baseline. And what that looks like is cooperatively play with mom and or dad at least 15 minutes per day up from 0 times. So we've got some pretty specific behaviors there identified. And, you know, that quality of life is based on some interpretation, but, you know, leisure skills are important skills for anybody. So the fact that we are increasing those leisure skills, the fact that we're increasing the appropriate requests to mom and dad, and that we have some interface with mom and dad on a cooperative level, I would speculate that that's going to increase everyone's quality of life. So we're going to move on now to the non-example. So real quick one, I'll give you a moment to kind of review that, and we're looking for the components of the element measurable, time limited, specific behavior for increase, and increasing the quality of life. So let's see what is or isn't there. Well, we've got goals measurable and time limited. It's not related to a specific behavior for increase. And I'm not sure that the quality of life is there. By the end of 6 months, Steve will reduce episodes of property destruction to 1 or fewer, increase the use of coping skills as evident by a reduction of property destruction. So we don't have, you know, it is time limited, 6 months. measurable. You can definitely measure the reduction of property destruction to 1 or fewer occurrences per month. That you can definitely measure. But are they related to a specific behavior to increase? Well, no, those goals aren't. It just says that we're increasing using coping skills by not doing something. And I think that might be maybe a dead man's test. Ah, I see you chatted that. Thank you. And of course, I'm not sure that any of that, I probably destroy a pen or two on a monthly basis. So I didn't make that goal. So we've gotten an example and a non-example. Let's go on to that challenge question here. And I'll give you a few moments and then we'll get that challenge up there. There are the questions. Again, we're looking to ensure that the element of 3 has those component parts: measurable, time limited, specific behavior for increase are related to goals, and goals increase the quality of life. All right, we are finished. Thank you for participating in the poll. Let's see what we've got. Well, yes, look at that. You participants are awesome. This particular challenge question, all the components were there. By the end of 3 months, time limited. Steve will do what? Maintain safe use of leisure items of 60 minutes per day and cooperative play with mom and dad at least 15 minutes. Cooperatively play with the same age peer at least 15 minutes per day, up from 0 minutes per day from baseline. We've got those time limited, measurable. We're looking at increasing from this number of minutes to this number of minutes of this skill. And, not only do we have the element of cooperation with the parent, but we've also got this other element that, they're going to definitely interact and cooperatively play with the same age peers. And, this again, it tied back to the goal we had just showed you, and how the goals might progress to treatment. So thank you very much, Lucas, for bringing that to my attention. So with that, we're on to element 4, and I'm going to pass the ball off to Melantha.
Thank you, Rita.
You're welcome.
So I am going to kind of talk through how I look at the elements as I am scoring them. So element 4, specific instructions for data collection procedures that reflect the behavior. And so as I'm looking through plans and I'm thinking about specific instructions, I want to understand if whoever is collecting the data, do they have steps that they need to take in order to understand how the data is collected? And then I also think about the dimensions of behavior. So is frequency and rate reflected? Is duration reflected? Is latency reflected? And so when I am using this checklist, I am thinking through all of those things. So the first section of this area looks at, as I stated, specific instructions for how the data is to be collected for all target behaviors. So the behaviors that are marked for increase and the behaviors that are marked for reduction. So looking at this, the second portion of this, again, data collection reflects those relevant dimensions of behaviors. And so, again, looking to see if they're looking at duration, latency, and frequency, and things of that nature. So going to the example, there is a data collection form that should be attached. Caregivers should record the duration of each instance of safe play using a stopwatch to indicate if it is cooperative or individual. If play moves from cooperative to individual, caregivers should mark a new instance of playing behavior. Each request for attention and instance of property instructions should be recorded along with the date and time. So I definitely think that this meets, and the green marks indicate that it does, the criteria. There is specific instructions for the caregiver on how the data should be recorded, and there is also a dimension of behavior reflected in this example. And so now we are going to move to the non-example. Data will be collected each day as part of the staff's daily log. Again, I am going back to how I score the plans. Is there specific instructions for the implementers? I definitely don't see that. I don't see a dimension of behavior reflected in this example either. So it definitely does not meet criteria. So I'm going to go to the challenge question. I'm going to give you guys a few minutes to read this in silence and score it. All right, the time is up. Thank you guys for participating. I see lots of participation. Thank you so much. So this definitely has instructions for the implementer on how to record the target behavior. However, we do not see any dimension of the behavior reflected in this example. There's no reference to duration, frequency, or so forth. So this would be scored as partial because there are instructions and the missing element of not having a dimension reflected. All right, I am going to pass the ball to Lucas.
Excellent, thank you. So now we're going to talk about antecedent strategies that affect the probability of target behavior. And this is both for those that you want to see increase and decrease. So the idea here is that you have some strategies in place that make it more likely that you get the behavior that you want and make it less likely that you get the behavior that you're trying to decrease. And just as a quick reminder, we're looking for both the increase and decrease. So I'm going to give you just a second here to read this example, and then we're going to talk a little bit about which elements are present. So this is a fairly short one. So I'm going to go ahead and just click to the next one. You can continue to read it as it will remain. You all are experts at this probably now going through this. So lo and behold, surprise, surprise, the example has both of the elements. So we have some strategies in here that should make it more likely that you get the behavior you want. So you've got check-ins every 10 minutes where they're specifically focusing on something that's desirable and not mentioning or commenting on something that's inappropriate, which would be an antecedent strategy that should decrease the likelihood that you're going to get more problems. And we're specifically giving the implementers, in this case the caregivers, some specific instructions on which types of things to avoid, like criticism, lecturing, really any kind of coercive interaction. And so these together should result in a higher chance that things go well and a lower chance that you have continued use of problem behavior. So these meet the components of this essential element. And then as we have done in the last elements, let's look at a non-example. So again, I'll give you a little bit of time to read this. I know it's really long. And then we're going to see which ones it has. So it says caregivers will frequently use tools of choice. Now, one of the things that you might be saying, if you understand or you recognize what tools of choice is, you might say, well, tools of choice is a really good thing that you can do that would decrease the chances you get problem behavior and increase the chances that you get desirable behavior. And while that's true, this doesn't tell me which tools to use. It doesn't tell me how often to use which tools. It just says they're going to use this curriculum frequently, which I don't know what frequently means. I don't know which tools. I don't know how those are being individualized for the person. So there's a particular tool called Pivot that has multiple options that you can select from when you're using that procedure, which if you want to translate Pivot into like technically accurate, ABA stuff, it's really just differential reinforcement. It's kind of putting the undesirable behavior on extinction and kind of moving and focusing on something that is appropriate. But I don't know how to do that for this person because that has 3 options in the general curriculum of tools of choice. How am I supposed to apply it to a particular person? I would need that level of instruction in this to be able to use it if I were an implementer. So just telling me we're going to use a stock off-the-shelf curriculum, even if that curriculum's awesome, doesn't give me enough detail in my BSP. Now remember, behavior support plan is supposed to be an individualized set of technology for this person to make their life better. Off-the-shelf components don't make behavior support plans. And then, continuing with our tradition here that we've established, you are going to get a chance to answer a challenge question. Now, this one, again, is very short, so take a few moments to read this and then answer the question, and we'll talk about it. All right, just about 20 more seconds. I don't know if it's me, but the remaining time counter is frozen. There we go. Fantastic. Okay, so you all recognize that there actually aren't any of the components of this essential element present. So letting Steve know every 10 minutes that you're not going to tolerate his property destruction while patting him on the back is probably not going to make it less likely that he engages problem behavior. So like applying coercion on it every 10 minutes is probably not going to result in less problem behavior. And it's certainly not increasing the likelihood that he's going to engage in desirable behavior. Now, one of the things that, and the reason why we have each one of these examples from the original context is because it makes it easier to see why this doesn't make sense. When you remember all the way back to the vignette, the case example, it becomes very clear that this doesn't mesh. Like this isn't logically related. Just generally, you know, for any human being, applying coercion specifically on a fixed time schedule is probably a bad idea. But specifically for Steve and his individualized circumstance, this is not likely to be a successful intervention. In fact, it's probably going to arrange for more property destruction, not less. Less safe use of leisure items, not more. So I think that's where we're going to pause for today, right, Rita? Or are we going to go through number 6 as well?
No, I think stopping here, we only have a very short amount of time, and this is a nice sort of demarcation point. So we'll go ahead and stop here for today.
Okay, so we can end recording for the day.